They were already half an hour into the morning brief when the insult landed, and it landed in a room full of people who should have known better, because the operations hangar was packed shoulder to shoulder with pilots, aircrew, intel officers, and maintenance chief staring up at the wall of screens showing the trapped convoy, the incoming weather front, and the red arc of predicted enemy strike routes. And still the laughter rose when Major Brandon Cole jabbed his pen toward the back row and said, "Sir, we're really putting our shuttle bus driver on this." So everyone turned to see who he meant and found her, Captain Elena Ward, sitting near the aisle in a worn flight suit with a faded blackbird patch on her shoulder and the same emblem stitched in tiny thread beneath a nameplate. And because he was a Golden Boy fighter ace with kills on his helmet and a reputation for aggressive flying, no one told him to shut up, which meant the room watched him get away with it while the mission clock in the corner of the main screen ticked down from T90, time bleeding away in quiet digital increments as the convoy's icon blinked amber in the mountains. The briefing officer hesitated only a fraction, because Cole wasn't just any pilot. He was a leader of the top strike squadron on base, and he knew everyone was looking at him. So when the ops major said, "Transport 3 will handle resupply and potential evac for Convoy Echo. Captain Ward will be your aircraft commander," Brandon snorted loud enough to carry and said, "With respect, sir, that's a cargo captain. We need real pilots on this. People who actually train for contested airspace." And then he stepped over to her on his way to the front, reached down, and with 2 fingers tapped the blackbird patch on her arm like it was cheap embroidery, adding, "Unless this cosplay ace thing means something we don't know about," which produced the kind of uneasy laughter that spreads when people feel they're supposed to choose sides and most pick the safe one. Elena didn't move away from his hand. She just let her jaw set the smallest bit, eyes still on the screen. Because answering him would mean shifting the whole room's attention to herself, and she knew from long experience that ego defense never changed anyone's mind. It only turned you into the second act of a show you didn't want to be in. So she simply said, "Copy mission tasking," in a level voice when the ops major's eyes flicked to her for confirmation. And because she didn't fight back, the insult hung there as accepted truth, making every young pilot in the room think that was all right. So when her call sign, Kestrel, was read last, tagged under support assets, people were already slotting her into a mental box labeled bus driver, not part of the real fight, while the wing commander at the side of the room kept his arms folded and his eyes glued to the scrolling intel feed instead of the faces, letting the moment pass unchallenged as the weather officer pointed at the radar sweep and said the deck would be dropping inside the hour, cloud bases sliding down the mountains, which meant windows would close fast and those men in the amber convoy icon would run out of sky cover just as enemy air reached them if someone didn't make every minute count. When the brief ended, it ended with nothing fixed except the humiliation. Convoy Echo still in trouble. Mission assignments locked with her as peripheral support, and a silence around what had just happened that felt heavier than the concrete walls, because no one had stepped in to say enough, and that meant the rules of the room had been set for the day, leaving her to walk out under a low ceiling of smirks and sidelong looks. That strange blackbird on her shoulder now just another joke in a building that was supposed to be a church for discipline. On the flight line, the sun hadn't yet burned the chill off the tarmac and the air smelled of fuel and metal, and the jets Cole loved were lined up nose to the wind with ground crews swarming over them while her own aircraft, a big gray transport scarred from years of service, sat a little farther down. Not ugly, just unglamorous, which made it a perfect mirror of how most of the base saw her. So as she walked toward it with her helmet under one arm and her checklist in her other hand, the voices in her headset crackled to life because someone in the fighter squadron had already patched the internal net through, and Brandon's voice came easy and bright. "Taxi One, you bring snacks for the tour group, or just in-flight movies?" And that nickname, Taxi One, hit the air with a ripple of laughter from other call signs checking in, which told her the joke from the brief had already grown legs and started running. She paused only long enough to answer ground control. Not him. Then knelt beside an open panel near the nose where young crew chief was wrestling with a stubborn connector, and when he muttered, "If you want, I can file a complaint about that crap up the chain. This is getting old," she shook her head once, steady and calm, because making it a formal issue right now would shift focus. which meant time and energy would flow away from convoy echo and toward feelings, and there wasn't time for that. So instead she pointed to the load sheet on his clipboard, ran a finger down the column, and quietly said, "Shift pallet 3 off 2 frames or we'll be tail heavy in the drop, and I want the countermeasure pods triple checked. No assumptions. If the jammers are live out there, our flare timing needs to be exact." And the chief blinked because most bus drivers didn't read a load sheet that fast or talk about jammer timing like they dance with it in a storm. But he just nodded and jogged back to his team while she continued her walk around. Her restraint, which came from years of learning when speaking cost more than it bought, read as something else over the net, because while she traced the route on a folded terrain map with a gloved finger, noting the narrow valley just off the planned corridor where old Sam's sights used to be buried, the Red Room chat continued without her, and one of the young lieutenants sent a photo to the squadron group, a quick snap of a faded black bird patch with the caption, "Angry Pigeon Air," which drew a string of laughing emojis and cartoon birds, and because no one in authority was in that chat to shut it down, it kept going until the kestrel became a running joke, a bird that never fights, which made it easier in their minds to treat her as background even as the tower called out over the common frequency. "Be advised, enemy air potential in 60 minutes. All assets, confirm readiness." Turning the vague time pressure from the brief into a real countdown. Cole used the time to angle for more glory, because when the ops desk announced a limited drone escort and an additional fighter pair hadn't cleared maintenance, he suggested, in a tone of helpful pragmatism, that those assets be shifted to his strike package instead of the transport run, arguing that real teeth belonged where the real fight was, and the overstretched duty officer, mind half on 3 other things, agreed, which left Elena's flight lighter on protection than the plan had intended. But because she didn't protest on the net, the silent assumption hardened. If she wasn't fighting for escorts, it must be because she was timid or because she believed the mission really would be just a bus ride. As her engine spooled up and the cockpit vibrated around her, she turned to her crew, ran them through emergency procedures with quick precision, not out of paranoia but because contact with chaos had taught her that standards were the only solid ground in a moving world. And while she spoke, "If we lose AWACS, we revert to terrain nav and internal timing. You watch the valleys, you watch the flares." The clock rolled down to T60 and the weather officer's voice cut across the net saying cloud bases were dropping 2,000 feet in the next half hour, which meant every route in and out of the pass would be tighter and darker by the time anyone reached convoy echo. Yet the laughter on squadron chat didn't stop until Tower finally cut them off with a stain. All flights switched to assigned mission frequencies, forcing them from mockery into checklist verbs. Taxiing behind the sleek fighters, she watched their tails carve heat in the air, each jet glowing like a promise of violence, and her big gray aircraft followed last in the line. A workhorse trailing racehorses, engines humming steady as ground crew gave final salutes, and from the control tower the world looked orderly. Jets ahead to strike, transport behind to haul, everyone following the script. But from Elena's seat the formation already revealed its pressure points because the convoy was still pinned in a mountain pass with an enemy advance rumored to be moving artillery closer, and the mission timeline, now measured not in hours but in fuel state and closing weather, meant that if anything pulled her back early or delayed her arrival, there would be no second wave, just a long-distance apology transmitted after the fact. She lifted off after Cole's squadron, wings biting into the gray light as the base receded behind her. And for the first few minutes the formation held textbook shape, fighters a protective arc ahead and above, the transport steady in the prescribed corridor, AWACS feeding them a clean picture. But because the earlier disrespect had been allowed to stand, it carried forward in the way he treated the plan. So when a faint radar blip appeared just off the edge of their clearance box and the regional controller mentioned it with a calm, "Possible contact, bearing 075, maintain current flight path," Cole read it less as a caution and more as an invitation to show off, replying, "Falcon Flight will check that out. Keep the bus on rails." And without waiting for explicit permission, he eased his element deeper toward the blip, bringing his wingman with him and stretching the protective shell away from her. The decision felt small in the moment, just a confident pilot chasing a ghost. But that choice pulled the escort net open like a loose stitch, leaving her big slow bird suddenly closer to the hostile radar horizon than anyone intended, which gave the enemy exactly what they needed. Because as the fighters moved out of the corridor, the jammers on the ground came alive. Fuzzing AWACS returns with electronic snow until the radar feed on her display began to flicker, lines of data stuttering as if the sky itself were glitching, and controllers in the background began to sound less like measured narrators and more like people thinking harder than they wanted to admit. Within minutes, a SAM launched from a hidden site in the hills, not because the enemy had magical timing, but because they had been waiting for overextended fighters to cross an invisible threshold, and the missile caught one of the escort jets with a glancing blow that tore into its tail, forcing the pilot to limp back toward base, trailing fuel and curses, which shrank the protective circle yet again and left Elena even more exposed. The regional controller, now faced with a degraded air picture and live enemy fire, defaulted to caution, calling all flights. This is Guardian. Advise withdraw to Corridor Bravo. Repeat, withdraw, regroup. Because by doctrine, when you start losing sensors and jets, you pull back. But that instruction collided with the convoy leader's voice bleeding into the net, tense and breathless, saying, "Any air. This is Echo Actual. We are minutes from being flanked. We cannot move. We need cover now. Or we are done." And that transmission shoved Elena into the vice she knew was coming. If she obeyed the tone of withdrawal and turned around, those men and women on the ground would be left under a sky she knew would soon be hostile and unforgiving. If she pressed on deeper into the pass with less escort and half-blind controllers, she would be going against the emerging mood of abort, which meant if anything went wrong, command would remember her decision, not the nuance that led there. In the middle of that squeeze, Cole, rattled but still clinging to his self-image, snapped over the net. "Cargo bird. Fall back to the base of the valley. This is what happens when we bring transports into an actual fight. You are not built for this." And the contempt in his voice under stress turned the Kestrel patch into a punchline under fire, while another pilot muttered on a side channel, "He's right. That thing's basically a flying target," reinforcing the narrative that she should be anywhere but here. Elena didn't answer him, because giving him airtime would dilute the narrow strip of mental bandwidth she had left for solving the geometry problem in front of her. So instead she did what she always did when the sky turned sharp. She shifted from chatter to pattern, switching to backup nav modes without comment, cross-checking terrain against memory and map while adjusting her altitude to skim just beneath where she knew older radar systems would merge ground clutter with metal, which meant she had to trust instincts honed in missions no one in this formation had clearance to discuss. And even as AWACS stuttered and fuel numbers ticked down, she quietly eased her aircraft toward that narrow secondary valley, slowly leaving behind the safety of the official flight corridor and with it any easy excuse to later claim she was just following orders. The first real comfort, escort and clean surveillance, was gone now. Not by accident, but because a series of allowed insults had taught Cole he could improvise past the plan without being checked, and his overreach, combined with her refusal to get into a power struggle over the net, left her isolated in a thinning sky where enemy jammers painted the air and the convoy below started calling now or never, with a strain in their voices that tightened the muscles in her neck. Still, she didn't flay. Her temper didn't explain, didn't tell them she'd flown into worse boxes than this and made it out, because explanations wouldn't move her any closer to the pass and would only brand her as defensive. So the misjudgment hardened under pressure, turning her calm into supposed cowardice just as the clock on the mission board rolled past T30 and the weather officer's earlier warning manifested as cloud layers that thickened around the mountain peaks, cutting lines of sight and making every approach path less forgiving. Time no longer felt like hours and minutes, but like a narrowing throat in the terrain, and it kept tightening as Cole, stung by the hit on his wingman and desperate to reassert control, violated the plan again, pushing his remaining element even deeper into hostile airspace to chase what he was sure were the origins of the jammer's signals, ignoring the sharper edge in Guardian's voice as the controller said, "Falcon lead. Maintain corridor. Repeat. Maintain. You are outside cleared." Because his pride was now tangled with survival, and he needed to prove to himself and everyone listening that he could fix the mess he'd helped create. That second push triggered exactly what any old enemy doctrine would predict: Multiple SAM batteries lit up in a staggered pattern. Enemy fighters scrambled from a hidden strip, and the air between the convoy and the pass turned into a kill box, not out of nowhere but because his earlier choices had given the other side an opening and they took it with ruthless speed, forcing local command into a panic pivot as voices began to talk over each other about aborting, rerouting, and cutting losses. In the noise, a clipped shout and a broken static burst told them Cole's jet had been hit hard, and seconds later his flat, stunned, "I'm ejecting," cut the frequency, followed by the high-pitched beeping of a beacon that began to pulse from somewhere in the hills between the convoy and the route home, creating two emergencies at once. The convoy still pinned and the downed pilot now lying in terrain the enemy would race to reach, which made the default procedural answer simple and brutal. Pull everyone back, mark his last location, and plan a separate rescue when the sky was less lethal, writing off Convoy Echo as a probable loss in the meanwhile. Controllers tried to restore order over the comms, calling for general withdrawal because a tactical picture was fragmenting into unreadable clutter, and they could not see enough to safely keep people in the fight, while in the background the brigade liaison's voice, representing the men on the ground, kept cutting in with escalating urgency, asking if air support was coming or if they should start burning sensitive gear before they were overrun. And for a few long seconds, nobody actually. On the moment, it was that gap, that stretch of paralyzed, overlapping orders and half-finished sentences, that forced Elena to choose between staying the role the room had assigned her or stepping into a different one entirely. And because everything that had led to this point, from the shrugged-off insult and the brief to the unchallenged reassignment of her escorts, had taught her how dangerous silence could be, she reached for the guarded switch on her console that almost no one on a simple transport was supposed to know how to use, and keyed in a priority command code that had not been heard on that net in years. The sound of her own voice surprised even her, not because it shook, it didn't, but because of how calm it came out as she said, "All call signs. This is Kestrel 1, in a tone that cut through jamming and panic alike, and before anyone could argue she added, "Raven protocol is active. On my mark, you will adjust to the following headings and altitudes," then began to lay out a sequence of maneuvers that only made full sense if you were holding the kind of mental map she carried. One built from countless hours watching enemy patterns form and break over different wars. For a heartbeat, the net went oddly still. Not silent, because there was still breathing and static and the distant thrum of engines, but still in the sense that no one contradicted her, and the controllers who had been stepping on each other's transmissions shut up long enough to copy down the vectors she was giving, because there is a quality in some voices under fire that makes people listen before they even realize they've decided to. And Hayes had it now. When she finished the first sequence with "execute in 5, 4, 3, 2, mark," fighters banked into new altitudes instead of doglegging home. Drones snapped into new orbits to burn through the jamming with focused beams. Artillery batteries back at the edge of the theater began slewing toward coordinates she called not from any live feed but from knowing where these enemy doctrines like to hide. And her own big A-craft rolled into a valley entry that put her much closer to threat rings than a cargo pilot should ever accept, because she understood that if the enemy believed the transport to be bait, they would expose their remaining teeth. On a side channel, a bewildered young pilot blurted, "Who the hell is Kestrel 1? And someone older, voice low and wary, replied, "That patch on her shoulder?" That unit was supposed to be gone, which meant at least one person in the air recognized the shape of the bird and the shadow of the program behind it. But explanations still didn't come, because there was no room now for history, only geometry and timing in the shrinking space on the mission clock, which had slipped to T10 with fuel states edging into the red. In the underground theater command bunker, the three-star in charge of the whole air campaign, Lieutenant General Marcus Hale, had been watching his wall of screens with a tightening jaw as the picture fragmented, and when the unauthorized priority code tripped an alert on his console and the call sign Kestrel 1 popped up on his battle roster, he froze with his hand halfway to a coffee cup, not because of superstition but because he had signed off on that call sign years ago when it belonged to a test pilot in a classified Wild Weasel program that turned slow, unremarkable A-frames into ghosts that baited air defenses into revealing themselves. So he told his staff, "Hold all overrides. Let her run it," in a voice that brooked no disagreement, and ordered every controller on the board to route assets through her commands, forcing the institution itself to shift around a fact almost no one in the building understood yet. In the next 10 minutes, cause and consequence braided tight. Her vectors drove drones into angles where their sensors caught the comb teeth of active radars peeking through the jamming, which meant artillery had precise enough coordinates to send shells screaming into hillside bunkers that had survived other, more conventional patterns. Her timing of phase and altitude changes drew one last desperate missile shot that tracked her big gray transport as if it were the easy kill the enemy assumed it to be, only to exhaust itself in a corridor where fighters now waited at the edges, using the missile's plume as a pointer, and as each threat revealed itself, the sky around Convoy Echo turned from a fog of unknown danger into a grid of clean targets. Down on the ground, the convoy commander heard the difference as well as saw it, because where the radio had been jammed with competing voices, it became a single channel of disciplined commands, Elena's voice telling him when to move trucks, when to hold, when to fire smoke, and as enemy fighters finally broke through the boiling clouds toward the pass, they ran into a pattern they didn't expect. Jet's position not where retreating assets would be but where someone who remembered their doctrine knew they would try to sneak, so they died in flame before they could bring guns to bear on the trapped vehicles. In the bunker, Hale watched the tactical display clarify, old wild weasel shapes emerging from the chaos, bait, reveal, strike, and when a staff officer balked at the idea of a transport captain directing this dance, he brought up her personnel file and saw the old notes. Test squadron, multiple live-fire trials, commendations redacted under classification, reassigned to transport after budget cuts and political shuffling. Not lack of ability. And he simply said, that Kestrel patch means she's volunteered to be bait more times than you've flown sorties. Which shut down the objection and reframed the symbol for everyone at that table even before the news reached the flight line. By the time the clock hit 0 on the predicted enemy strike window, the strike hadn't materialized not because the enemy had changed their mind out of fear, but because the launchers and radars that would have enabled it lay in ruin, mapped and targeted in real time by someone the room had written off as a bus driver, and a controller's steady voice announced, Convoy Echo reports minimal casualties and is moving again. No active air threats in their sector, followed by the quieter report. CSAR has the down pilot, inbound through a clear corridor, which meant the two crises born from arrogance and silence had both been pulled back from the edge by a pilot no one had bothered to see. When Hale finally keyed his own MIC to the mission net, he didn't give a speech. He just said, Airspace is now silent. Kestrel 1, return to base, and in that line, spoken over a frequency where so many had heard her dismissed hours earlier, the hierarchy turned, because to be called by that name from that mouth in that context told everyone who she truly was. The flip did not finish in the sky, though. It finished where the humiliation had begun, in the same hardened hangar they used as an ops and debrief room, now filled again with pilots and staff, only this time the laughter was gone, replaced by a weird, anticipatory hush as Hale walked to the front instead of appearing on a screen, carrying a tablet tucked under one arm. He replayed only a short segment of the mission audio, the 30 seconds where overlapping panic gave way to her calm, all call signs. This is Kestrel 1, and the crisp chain of commands that followed. Then he paused the recording and set the tablet down, letting the silence stretch because he understood how public spaces teach their own lessons. When he spoke, it was in the same even tone he used in combat briefings, saying that effective immediately Captain Elena Ward was being appointed mission lead and tactical doctrine advisor to a new airspace denial task force operating from this base, and that all flight elements would treat her directives in contested airspace as they would his own delegated authority. There was no applause, no cheer, only the collective intake of air that comes when a room realizes the story it told itself that morning no longer fits the facts, and in that drawn breath the power she hadn't taken for herself earlier flowed toward her whether anyone liked it or not, because the seal of institutional judgment had been stamped publicly in the place where she had been made small, and Brandon Cole, sitting stiff in the second row with a bandage still peeking from under his collar, understood in a flood of heat that his earlier jokes about bus drivers and cosplay patches would live in the same memory as the recording of her voice guiding the mission that pulled him back from a hillside. The consequences didn't come as spectacle either. They arrived as orders slid across desks and signatures on forms, as Cole's reassignment to a training squadron far from the front became a quiet matter of record, as reprimands found their way into the files of those who had broken formation without clearance or used internal nets to mock a fellow pilot in an active theater, and as news sops circulated reminding everyone that A-frames did not define competence and that patch insignia, authorized or not, were not to be used as punchlines in the shadow of live operations. On the edges of all that paperwork, in squadron chats and late-night hangar conversations, a new sort of rumor took root. Not the old jokes about birds that never fight, but questions whispered in the tone usually reserved for legends. What exactly had that black kestrel meant? What kind of missions needed a transport as bait? What did it feel like to fly into a kill box on purpose and come out with the sky emptied of threat? None of those questions were answered by briefing slide or documentary, because Elena refused interviews and declined to turn her mission into a brand. Instead, she returned to the rhythm she trusted. Walk, check, fly. And that was how dawn found her the next morning on the flight line. The air cool and thin, the world tinted soft gold as the first light slid across the tarmac and climbed the belly of her aircraft. A crew chief stood on a small ladder beneath her cockpit window, brush in hand, carefully painting a neat black kestrel silhouette just forward of the crew door, placing it beside a line of tiny, almost discrete symbols representing dismantled radar sites and neutralized launches, and behind him a handful of pilots and maintainers watched without talking, hands in pockets, breath fogging in the chill. One of the younger lieutenants, who had laughed loudest at the angry pigeon meme 2 days before, reached up to his own helmet as if it weighed more than it had yesterday, peeled off a faded sticker that showed a cartoon missile chasing a fleeing car, folded it between his fingers, and slipped it into his flight suit pocket, glancing at Elena's patch with a tight, unsure nod as if beginning a language he was only just learning. She crossed the distance from the hangar to her aircraft at an easy pace, boots clicking softly on concrete, and as she walked, people shifted out of her path, not the way they did for a temper or a tyrant, but the way they moved for someone whose presence marked the difference between chaos and order. No one saluted out of sequence. No one called for a speech. They just gave her space and quiet nods, the small, practical gestures by which militaries show real respect. Standing at the base of the ladder, she paused long enough to watch the crew chief finish the kestrel, then lifted a hand to the worn patch on her own sleeve, thumb brushing the edges where the color had long ago faded from repeated washings, not polishing it or straightening it for show, just acknowledging that it now meant something different in the eyes around her than it had yesterday, even though the cloth itself had not changed. And when she finally climbed into the cockpit and pulled the hatch closed, the only sounds on the line were the clink of tools, the faint murmur of low conversation, and the steady tick of cooling metal as the sun rose over an airspace that, for the moment, remained utterly, blessedly silent.